Good afternoon, everyone. This is Troy Grable. I will be the moderator for today's webinar, and thank you for attending LeanLogistics Capacity Marketplace webinar series. Today we're going to tackle the topic of measuring success. We've unpacked over the course of the last few months becoming a shipper of choice and how a carrier management strategy plays into your shipper of choice initiatives. Today we're going to focus on the importance of measuring the success of that shipper of choice strategy. And once again, we brought together a panel of transportation experts that will share their insights and thoughts on what metrics matter when you measure your shipper of choice program. Before we get started, a couple housekeeping items I'd like to take care of. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask our panelists, you can type them in the chat box of your GoToWebinar client. Or if you're a Twitter user, please tweet us your questions at #MeasuringSuccess. To start off, I'd like to introduce our panelists. We have a guest with us today, Julie Ritchie. Julie is the U.S. Transportation Logistics Manager over at Abbott Nutrition, a division of Abbott Laboratories. Julie is responsible for the U.S. freight and P&L, including freight procurement and transportation operations. Abbott Nutrition services the retail CPG market, the acute care, and elderly patient markets while achieving P&L goals by focusing on process and cost optimization initiatives that are driven by the systems and data that Abbott uses. We also have, and welcoming back, Tim Dalton. Tim directs all of our procurement services and oversees the full service and DIY procurement projects here at LeanLogistics. Tim's previous background within the 3PL and carrier marketplace really provides our customers and the expertise and deep understanding of that carrier network and assures our clients' success during procurement events. And we're welcoming back Lisa Kerr. Lisa is Director of Business Consulting here at LeanLogistics. Lisa works closely with our new clients on the development and implementation of logistics strategies and how to leverage managed transportation services to drive cost and service improvements. Lisa's experience spans across Procter & Gamble and Steelcase and provides our clients a level of expertise and assurance to achieve their operational results. Thank you all again for attending. And we've all heard the buzzword and the saying, becoming a shipper of choice. And we've discussed in detail what that means and the relationships between the carrier and business side and what practice and standards need to be set out. And we're going to tackle how to monitor and measure your shipper of choice initiatives. And let's start with you, Julie, As our guest, I'd like to give you the first crack at this and really have you kind of help us understand what metrics matter the most there at Abbott.
Well, great. Troy, thanks for having me on the panel. Shipper of choice is a really hot topic. We've all heard it a lot. And being shipper of choice in the current freight environment may be our last chance as shippers to really lock in our relationships with carriers before this capacity crunch gets really bad. What I hear carriers saying is that real shipper partners drive out waste and inefficiencies from their processes. Those would be things like reducing detentions at loading and unloading, reducing high reefer run times, driving out empty miles by having a new load waiting for a driver near his drop, and keeping administration low. So things like RFP frequency matter because they require staffing for administration. And through other less measurable things like keeping drivers happy. Next, I want to comment that our suppliers are smart, and they are scorecarding and measuring us as much as we are them. Our carriers have pointed out areas of our business that drive up costs, and knowing where we stand in these areas helps us at Abbott take corrective action and ultimately improve our rankings with our carriers. So in some ways you could say that we measure ourselves through our carriers' eyes. And we feel this is worth the effort because it positions Abbott for the longer-term tight capacity environment where it's expected there will be heavy competition for every load. So when it comes to measuring waste and inefficiency, here are a few areas that we review. I measure load and unload detentions at our distribution centers, and I send this information out at least quarterly to the distribution centers and their upper management team. Detentions are a really hot topic for carriers. Carriers will never recover their lost revenue through collecting on an accessorial rate. So that means that carriers, what they really want is to keep their equipment moving. Carriers are looking for shippers to improve business practices at their pickup and drop-off points and reduce or even eliminate the occurrence of detention. I've even heard of 100% drop and hook operations. Abbott's not there yet, but I understand why carriers are looking for that. If shippers needed any more of a nudge to begin cleaning up their own houses, we are now hearing that the government will be stepping in on this one on the side of the carrier. So for shippers, there really is no better time than now to start working on this one. Another inefficiency item that I'm measuring internally is trailer detention and storage on site. I mentioned drop and hook operations, so this metric ensures me that our equipment is cycling through the distribution centers. So when our own distribution centers hold trailers beyond the contracted times, the fees get pretty big pretty quick. And carriers view this as another area driving costs into their operation because that equipment is more valuable to them moving than parked in a shipper's lot. So again, I send that information out weekly to the distribution centers. Next, reducing back office work for carriers and shippers is important in this era where everyone is doing more with less. Handling rate discrepancies is brutal on both carriers and shippers, and quick rate loading and accurate rate loading is the next area that I'm keeping a close eye on internally. So Abbott recently implemented technology where rates are uploaded into our rating systems rather than being manually keyed. This allows us to more quickly administrate RFPs with more accuracy on the rate loading. My last item in this area is payment cycle time, because we feel that cash flow is important to carriers. We've always had decent payment terms on our freight invoices, and we recently converted freight payment systems that further improved our payment cycle time to carriers. 80% of our freight invoices are paid about 20 days after the loads are delivered. So you can see how we're using metrics to make us a better shipper and have a tight shipping operation. And this has been very deliberate. Abbott Transportation has shifted focus over the last several years to becoming easier to do business with. And we're continually trying to improve in all these areas, and we feel it helps us be a shipper of choice in a very tough marketplace. Thanks, Troy.
Thank you, Julie. Appreciate your insights there. Tim, let's shift it over to you. In our last webinar, we heard a great deal from the carrier community and actually their perspective on the shippers. And as you manage the procurement events for our clients, you've had probably a pretty unique opportunity to advise them on how they should view the carriers. What metrics are important for from a shipper's perspective of its carriers?
Yeah, no, thanks, Troy. I think I think to start out is when I think of metrics, they're obviously very important because they help to drive greater efficiency within one's network. But I think we need to all look at metrics a little bit differently now, and I think we have to just look at the metrics from a benefits standpoint and really look at them as far as how you can use them to improve your overall processes and relationships with your carriers versus penalizing your carriers. As Julie mentioned, we've heard from the carriers lately on how important it is to eliminate waste, and it's typically the learnings that come from those metrics that allow us to do that. And a lot of those waste that you can identify are typically the things that are irritants to the drivers. And with drivers right now, with most of the drivers having an impact as to whether they're going to take one shipper's load over another, since they typically have choices, doing what you can to eliminate some of those irritants is key. Typically when I'm going through an RFP, one of the things that we'll do as we're working with our shipper partners is to look through all their metrics and overall requirements. Because if you are going to make a change to what's expected of your partners, the RFP process in that time is probably the best way to do it, to go back and look to see what your goals are that you're communicating while ensuring that those goals are in line with your organization's expectations. I think that as shippers are evaluating their carriers and as they're communicating with their carriers, I think some of the main ones to look for are some of the ones that are probably most basic. I think tender acceptance. Tender acceptance is one of the most obvious metrics to follow when grading your carriers. Typically, I always look at tender acceptance as the metric that really drives the bus, because if you have carriers that have committed equipment to you and they're not taking your freight, that's typically when you're going down the routing guides, you're going to the spot markets, and your costs are increasing. And if anything, it's having a negative impact on your budget. By reviewing your tender acceptance, down to the lane level, and doing it, as you're implementing that RFP, and afterwards, it's important to identify where you could potentially see an issue, so then you can go back to your carrier partners and review it, and to make sure that there isn't an issue or that they didn't overcommit on a lane. And a lot of times what folks will find is that there was some sort of a disconnect between maybe the pricing department or the sales person down to the dispatcher, where the appropriate level of communication related to the commitments didn't make its way to the person actually accepting the load. On-time performance is obviously always important. You have expectations of your carriers, but then your customers have expectations of you as well. And one of the things I know that gives folks heartburn is, as their costs are going up, because those committed carriers aren't taking your freight, then a lot of times as your costs go up, they'll see that their on-time performance goes down. So, again, it's that balancing act between cost and service, but from an overall expectation standpoint, we just need to be very clear with our carriers and provide them with that information so they understand how they're doing. Givebacks is another one to really look for, especially as you're going through the RFP process and afterwards as well. Looking to make sure that your carrier partners aren't accepting loads and then giving the load back to you after they've accepted. Typically when that occurs, it's the day that the load is supposed to ship. So as a result, to recover that load, chances are you're going to be paying a premium to cover it, and if anything, your service to your customer will more than likely be impacted. Load expirations, as you're going through the RFP process, is important to look at. If you're finding that after you've implemented a procurement event, and if you're finding that your carriers aren't accepting your loads, probably the most important first step to take is to reach out to the carriers and to ensure that the appropriate contact is receiving the tender, and to make sure that it's not some sort of a systems issue or settings issue, and to make sure that your offers are being directed to the appropriate person. Claims ratio is always important from a metric standpoint, just to really understand, if you do have certain service providers more than others that you have claims with, and then from there you can take that and you can really look at it from an all-in standpoint, because you may find that you may have a service provider from a rate standpoint there's great opportunity or great upside to work with that partner. But if you find that they have a high amount of claims, that all-in cost may not be what you thought it was. I think lastly, and Julie hit on it as well, is as transportation departments are getting smaller, it's that invoice accuracy piece. And Julie mentioned as far as how they upload their rates from an efficiency standpoint and accuracy standpoint. But it's really that accuracy to make sure that what you're expecting to pay is what you're being billed. It'll save your organization time. It'll save your carriers a lot of time as well. And I encourage that if you're not currently using a system to manage that freight pay process, I would encourage you to do that, because it really takes out a lot of guesswork, and it really puts it up front as far as what the carrier is going to be paid. So if there are any questions, it's being taken care of right away versus after when the invoice hits your transportation department. So again, those are just a handful of metrics that we typically go through as we're going through that procurement process, Troy, and really those that you want to be very, very clear with your customers from an expectation standpoint, just to ensure that everyone's on the same page.
Thanks, Tim. That's some great insight. And making sure we have the metrics we need for our carrier partners. It kind of brings me, you mentioned carrier scorecards, and kind of brings me to a question I'd like to have our audience answer. And there's a panel question that we have there up in your webinar client. And how many of you, our attendees of this webinar, use carrier scorecards to measure your carriers? And again, you can click the answers right there in your webinar client. And I see they're all coming in at this point in time, and obviously there's a good amount of you that do, and there's a good handful of you that don't. And we'll get to the final results, but I want to pass this question over to Lisa here. Lisa, through your years in the industry, you've had a lot of insight and probably have a great understanding as to what success looks like, and how shippers and carriers need to really partner. And I was curious, from your perspective, what other metrics do you find that are critical to measure that success?
Well, thank you, Troy, and good afternoon, everyone. Let me build on what Julie and Tim have shared so far by suggesting just a few more metrics that matter as a shipper of choice. And Julie talked around payment cycle time, and I was reading a recent article in the Inbound Logistics magazine titled 4 Ways to Become a VIP Shipper Partner. And what it talked about was the results of a recent survey reinforcing that, bottom line, economics remain the most important factor influencing how carriers are evaluating shippers. So that brings me to the first metric that matters, days to pay. As basic as it is, once you've determined what your contract payment terms will be to your carrier partners, measure your performance. Whether your terms are net 30 or 45, or even if you have quick pay options, 1%, 15 days, you need to abide by them. And another small detail that's important is be clear with the carriers when the clock starts and when the clock stops. Does it start from day of shipment, or date of delivery, or date of invoice? And when does the clock stop to measure those those days to pay? Is it from day of mailing the check, or the day the carrier receives it, or it's deposited if ACH? Small details, but you need to be very clear around keeping those commitments. Tim also talked about tender acceptance. Well, the flip side of that is the second metric that matters as a shipper of choice, and that's routing guide compliance. So think of it, while tender acceptance is a measure of carriers taking loads, routing guide compliance is a measure of shippers giving loads. So go back to your transportation RFP, right? That's where routing guides are created. You need to know, through those routing guides, which carrier will be hauling how many loads in which lanes at what rate. So it's important then that your planning team is applying the correct routing guide so that carriers are in fact receiving the expected volume of tenders for the lanes that are awarded from the RFP. Certainly having a system in place for ensuring routing guides are followed, or even being able to restrict the sequence or waterfall of loads is essential, because going back 30 to 60 days after a shipment to audit if routing guides were followed or not, and really more important, understanding why they might not have been followed, is near impossible. So the third metric, still keeping carrier economics top of mind, and if you're serious about being a shipper of choice, is back to detention. Julie talked about this, but let me get more specific about what to measure, right? You'll want to measure both the percent of detention as a percent of total line haul spend, and the number of loads by facility, supplier, customer location, and by carrier that are incurring detention in your network. Now think about it. A $500 occurrence of detention on a single load means something very different than incurring 5 $100 occurrences of detention on loads. So you need to know where problems are happening quickly and take action before you start to experience any capacity issues. And if you're performing well in this area, use it as a demonstrative measure to your carrier partners that you are serious about being a shipper of choice. You know, to quote a carrier from the recent FTR conference last week, and probably all carriers would echo this sentiment, they don't want to get paid detention, they want to eliminate detention. And with that, Troy, I'll turn it back to you.
Excellent. Thanks, Lisa. That's some great insight. You know, I'm going to go back to the poll results really quick. And, you know, 76% of our audience says they do have or they do use some sort of carrier scorecard, and 24% say they don't. So, you know, that's interesting for all of us that we're attending this webinar to really understand. And I think now it kind of leads us to the question of all right, if we measure this shipper of choice program, what do I do with the data? And Julie, I think hearing from you, this is probably something that our audience would love to hear. And you know, what does it mean there for you at Abbott, and how do you guys you know, discern what that carrier scorecard and you know, what that really means to you and your partnerships with your carriers?
Well, it's a great question, Troy, and I've got this hanging in my office, and people in the office know this about me. I am a metrics junkie, and I have this saying that says, if you can measure it, then you can manage it. And I would say that turning metrics into a message begins with knowing what you want to say. And my point here is that it begins with having a high-level strategy in place. And it's important because being a shipper of choice only happens with intentional action. From there, metrics are directed at 3 audiences. I target my upper management, internal groups, and then the carrier. So my upper management communication sounds a lot like yours does, which is like this. Here's the problem. Here's why it's important. Here's the strategy and the commitments that I need from you. And at this level, it's really the dollars that matter. So it's important to translate the metrics into the cost of the problem and then drive home the cost reduction or the avoidance through your proposed strategy or the mitigation plans, because at this level, money talks. Then with internal groups, by this I mean load planners who need to know their routing guide compliance and the financial impacts of tendering outside of the routing guide. Also the distribution centers or any other internal partner at the execution level who need to know they're being measured on their trailer counts or their occurrences of detention at load or unload, and how their performance can financially benefit the organization. And metrics show trends, so also recognizing the associates at this level for their work towards accomplishing the overall strategy helps a lot too. And then with carriers, I communicate, and the team communicates with them regularly at the lane level, talking about specific tactical items like pickup, delivery performance results, or lanes that are plagued by tensions or other bad shipper or receiver behavior. And at the carrier management levels, the metrics communication is around that high-level performance and progress on our strategies, joint business updates, and exploring further partnership opportunities. I'll finish up with this thought. One thing we know for sure is that carriers are looking for partners who demonstrate continual process improvement. And that is because carriers are discriminating between customers because they can. They're choosing to do business with their customers who focus on carriers and drivers, and they treat them fairly in the office through good administration practices and on every pickup and delivery of a load, where a driver is looking for a bathroom or a snack, or they just want to get in and out. And the remaining shippers are left hitting up the spot market for the capacity. Thanks, Troy.
Thank you, Julie. So Lisa, everybody in the transportation and supply chain industry needs to understand their data, but also they need to view it through the lens of improving, their transportation initiatives or their shipper of choice programs. Lisa, what are your thoughts on how to use the data and what to do with it?
Sure. One of the most important things is the obvious, making the metrics that matter visible to the appropriate constituents inside and outside your organization. And Julie talked about those groups. I'm going to focus more on the internal audiences in my comments here. And so two tools that I've used successfully as a practitioner in my past are executive level and planner level dashboards, because you want the right information visible to the right audiences that have some level of accountability to the results, right? So think about it. By now you should have communicated your shipper of choice philosophy and strategy around the organization and why, right, what it means to the organization of behaving in that manner, of being a good business partner. And most important, it starts with making sure that you're fulfilling your financial obligations to your carriers. Not deviating from your RFP commitments, not onboarding additional partners and diluting freight amongst those carriers, and being very responsive and communicative with the carriers. So how does this manifest itself in an executive dashboard? I'd recommend some very basic things. And before I get into the elements here, keep it to those top items only. You don't want to flood people with metrics that don't matter. Stay with the ones that are a priority. Because as Julie said, many of us in the logistics industry are metrics junkies. But you want to be giving the fewest and the best ones to those internal audiences. So for executives, it's as simple as load volume and spend by carrier measured against what the RFP indicated the carrier could expect to receive through the award. Another one, days to pay. If your contract terms are 30 days, how close are you running to 30 days? The number of carrier partners utilized in a period. If you have 30 carriers in your routing guide, but you're noticing that you've tendered to 40 to 50 different carriers in the period, there's a problem somewhere and you need to know it and fix it. Also, developing and maintaining that schedule of carrier calls and review meetings. It's as simple as keeping a list. Did the meetings happen with the right participants at the right time? And then finally, detention as a percent of freight spend and load volume again. But most importantly for your executive level dashboard, what are the industry benchmarks and how do you compare? You should be outperforming the market as a shipper of choice. Now, going to a planner level dashboard, it's important to provide your individual team members that are doing the execution and the day-to-day management with a little different view of performance in those areas that they manage. So the metrics here need to be around routing guide compliance. Every team member should know how close they're performing to 100% routing guide compliance and what the reasons are if they aren't. They should understand that frequency of detention by carrier, customer, facility, and supplier. They should know the timeliness of loads being appointed, which is an underlying factor often for detention. So if carriers are making the calls, are they doing it according to the expectations that are set, or if those appointments are being made internally, are they being done according to the goals and expectations? Also, the number of corrective action plans received and resolved. So this should be, maintained on an ongoing basis. And then lastly, at a planner level, they should be watching the percent and number of rate change requests received from carriers. So if there's any variance to what carriers ultimately ask for in the form of payment compared to what was originally tendered, they need to understand that and possibly change a process to make sure they line up better and that they're eliminated. Ultimately, it's about making sure that the organization is performing at large against the goals and the commitments that have been made to the carrier partners. So getting those different levels of visibility and the accountability is key. Troy, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Okay, Tim, you've seen the audience response to our poll question on carrier scorecarding, which is encouraging to see that our audience is using a lot of the techniques or some of the techniques that we're talking about here today. What are your thoughts on how a company can use the data to keep their focus on becoming a shipper of choice?
Yeah, I think that with the poll results coming back at, I think 76% were using it. I'd say for those 76%, I'd say that you've already satisfied one of the major components of being a shipper of choice. And with a lot of the conversations that I've had with carriers, as it relates to the topic, is one of the main things, besides obviously you want to eliminate the tension and waste and other things, but one of the big components to being a shipper of choice is your communication level. So it's being transparent, it's communicating, and it's sharing the data with your partners. And the feedback that I've gotten is that carriers welcome the carrier scorecard. They want to know how they're doing, whether it's good or bad, because most carriers, they're already measuring themselves, from an internal scorecard standpoint. So one of the things that it does is if the shippers that they're working with are also providing them with a scorecard, they're able to compare, what the customer's perception is to what they're showing as reality. And if there is a difference, both parties can come together to really determine, what's making up that difference. It's the communication, it's the partnership that folks are looking for, and I think the scorecard really is a tool that initiates the conversation. An area of caution, as it relates to scorecards, and again, they're very, very important, but a scorecard, like data in general, is very black and white. So, one of the keys to implementing a scorecard is ensuring that ahead of time you're reaching out to your carriers and you're letting them know what it is exactly that they're going to be receiving, what they should do with the scorecard once they received it, first how to read it, but then also what your expectations are with how you'd like them to use it. So if you have an expectation that if a carrier's score is below X, that they have 1 week to provide you with a corrective action form, for example, it's that type of information that you want to be very clear with your partners so they understand exactly, what you want them to do with the scorecard. I think another thing too is as you're rolling it out and you're communicating with your carriers is to let them know how you plan on using it, because again, kind of going back to the comment as far as data or scorecards being black and white, and pretty much a scorecard, the information that's showing on a scorecard for the most part is all based on the information that the carrier's providing you. So as they're closing their loads out in systems, they're providing what the actual times were that they've arrived. They're the ones providing what the appointments were. So in a lot of ways, the data that drives the scorecard is based on the information that the carrier themselves are inputting. But one of the things that you'll find with the scorecard is that carriers want to focus on the one load that you show that they were late when they show that there was a reason as to why it was out of their control as to why they were late. So I think it's important to really kind of share with them what you're looking to get out of it. And, and as far as what that is, I'd say that, most shippers are using a scorecard as a directional tool to really look at how their partners are performing in a consistent format amongst all of their, I guess, competition. And if anything, I think it's important to say that, you're not necessarily drawing a line in the sand and saying, okay, if you're above this line, you're great. If you're below this line, you're terrible. But if anything, you're using the data and you're using your scorecard as a way to initiate the conversation, to get back to communicating so you understand as far as what the root cause is. And if anything, then if you do find that there is a problem, you're working together to resolve those issues. So again, I've said it today, I've said it in the previous webinars as well, as it relates to being a shipper of choice, eliminating waste and communicating and being transparent with your partners is what's really going to help to develop and establish that trust and ultimately that loyalty that they have with you, which hopefully will drive in a long and successful relationship with your partners.
Excellent. Thanks, Tim. I appreciate your insights there. So that's a wrap on our webinar. We are going to shift into the Q&A session, and it looks like there's already quite a few different questions that are coming in. I've got this first one here, and Tim, I'm going to throw it back over to you real quick. It says this: I have a good idea of the metrics that matter to ensure that my organization is behaving as a shipper of choice, but what are realistic goals or targets for each measure? For example, if I'm going through all this effort with the carriers around keeping commitments to my RFP awards, should I expect my tender acceptance to be 100%? If my contract terms are net 30 and my average days to pay is 32, is that good enough?
I think from setting realistic goals or targets, really that's going to vary based on shipper and kind of what your benchmarks are, where you're at today. If you're at 32% tender acceptance, it's probably not realistic to say that your goal for the year should be 90%. But what you want to do, I think, is you want to try to benchmark yourself against how others are doing. Reach out to other shippers, peers that you may have, and get a feel for how others are performing, and then start to put that plan in place. As far as how you can ultimately get there. But from the point in which you're at 32, for example, and in wanting to get to 85 or 90, put in some of those milestone goals along the way, just so you can make sure that you're tracking towards where you ultimately want to be. And then from there, build your carrier strategy, build your plan, build your processes to ensure that you're looking at your carriers individually, that you're communicating, you're establishing a meeting cadence, and you're working with your carriers to ensure that you're really all driving towards the same thing. And then also, it's okay to remove a carrier from a routing guide. So if you find that a carrier is on a routing guide and they're never taking the load, and they've communicated to you that they're never going to take the load, remove them. If they've been open with you and if they've communicated with you, you probably shouldn't ding them unfairly if they've held up their part of the deal as far as coming back to you and providing that level of communication. And then also, if anything, you're just wasting time with keeping a carrier on a routing guide. So again, look to see where you're at. I think most folks are looking at that probably 80 to 85% from a tender acceptance standpoint as far as where they'd like to be. Is 100% realistic? I'd say in probably the majority of your freight, probably not, because things happen. But probably 80 to 85% is more realistic. If it's a dedicated movement where you have an agreement with a carrier partner that says, okay, from point A to point B, we're going to give you 5 loads per day, and if they've committed on, an exact number, which is very, very consistent, day over day, week over week, I think your expectations can be a little bit higher. But for, general transactional type freight, I don't think 100% is realistic. And from a payment standpoint, as long as you're close to that 30 days, I think you're fine. If you're at 32 days, you're probably fine. And in the event that you're not, you can be sure that your carriers will let you know.
Yeah,
Excellent.
just a couple things I would add on to Tim's response. When you think about measuring something like tender acceptance, for example, you can measure it in some pretty creative ways that help you really observe performance from different angles. So, for example, what's tender acceptance for loads that have 48 or 72-hour lead time, and what's tender acceptance for loads that have less than 24 hours lead time? And again, think about your partnership with that carrier. Same thing for days of the week. What's happening tender acceptance between a Monday or a Friday, or by distance band. So you can get really creative with these metrics to ultimately slice and dice and identify where there are problem areas, and also to pre-communicate what the commitment level is that you're expecting from carriers as a normal course.
Cool. Thanks for jumping in there, Lisa, and adding to it. I think this next question probably will be a good dovetail into that. I'm going to let you tackle it first. And it's how can I benchmark my performance against other leading shippers? Should I ask my carriers how I rank in the categories that matter most to them?
So definitely asking your carriers how their best shipper partners are performing is essential, because you want to know kind of their level of expectations and what makes a good shipper. But another good resource is there are different benchmarking resources available in the market, both from a rate benchmarking standpoint as well as a service level benchmarking standpoint. So there are resources available that can tell you industry-wide or even by region how tender acceptance is running, how routing guide compliance is running, and so forth. So you can use your carrier partners as well as external kind of for-hire resources, if you will.
Great. Julie, we'll take this one last question. I want to be respectful of everyone's time, but let's have you take this last question. What are some successful strategies that others have found for problem consignees that drive up detention or wait time, and etc.?
Oh, well, that's a tough one, and on that one, I would say I wish there was a silver bullet, and I wish someone would tell me the answer to that one as well. So, I mean, we have that problem as well. We've got consignees that are difficult. We even have our own distribution centers that are difficult. So I think it's fair to acknowledge that issues exist within the supply chain, both on the shipper and consignee side of the business. And when dealing with consignees, we have liaisons in our business that interface between the customer and the supply chain elements. So what that means is we focus heavily on collaboration with our customers. So, I mean, when we have a problem lane or a problem customer driving an issue in multiple lanes, depending on what the problem is, we do present it this way. Here's the problem. Here's why it's important. And we're looking for ways to improve and to develop a joint solution with you. So, like I said, I don't think there's any silver bullet on this one. I think it's fair to say that we all appreciate being part of a discussion, and sometimes we don't know that we're part of a problem. So I think educating customers that we are having a problem. Sometimes the buyers have no idea that the receiving agents at their distribution centers maybe are not granting delivery appointments, things like that. So I would say that starting with circulating the problem among the right people at your customer is the best place to start, and then work toward a solution from there.
Yeah, and Troy, just to jump on that one real quick, another thing to add, in addition to what Julie mentioned, some of the shippers that I've worked with in the past, some of the things that I've seen is, one, it's measuring it, it's understanding, where your detention is occurring. With your consignees, because if there's detention, obviously they're holding up the carriers or holding up the drivers. Some of the other things that I've seen is that it's tracked and it's provided. You're providing it to the CSR reps. The CSR reps are going to their customers to let them know. If you're not seeing any improvement there, you know, I've seen it where shippers will go back to their sales folks, and if anything, they may build in some of that expense into their pricing that they have with their customers. And also I've seen it before where, you know, if there continues to be a problem constantly, which is starting to really impact, you know, your rates or your ability to find carriers to haul load because of the problem, I've also seen it before where shippers will go back to their customers to see if there's an opportunity to convert the lane to a CPU program, for example. You know, if it would just make more sense and if the customer themselves has the ability to pick up their own freight. So those are just a few other things that I've seen in addition to what Julie mentioned.
Thanks so much, Tim. Well, I want to again be respectful of everyone's time, and we've got quite a few questions that have come in via the chat box and also Twitter. And to our attendees, I will make sure that Julie, Tim, and Lisa all pitch in to answer the questions that we did not get to, and we apologize to not getting to them. But thanks so much to our panelists for sharing your insights and thoughts today with our audience, and thank you to our audience for attending this series on becoming a shipper of choice and how to measure that success. I would like to remind you that there will be an on-demand version of this webinar available shortly after the broadcast at LeanLogistics.com. And if you missed any of the other previous webinars, you can also download those at the same location at LeanLogistics.com. You know, we will be conducting additional webinar series, and our next webinar is actually going to be hosted on October 21st. This will be, Lean Logistics will be a guest with Talking Logistics, and we really encourage you to register there, and really encourage you to dial in and tune in on October 21st as Lean Logistics and Talking Logistics unpack additional industry you know, strategies and insights. Thanks again for your time, and have a wonderful rest of your day.